So we talk a lot about the vessels within the Expanse, but I figured today we could take a closer look at how and where these vessels are built. So let's take a look at the shipyards of the Expanse. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So building something as large as a warship to operate in space is always going to be a practical challenge, at least from a realistic standpoint. Generally, building something that large has to be done in space, or has to be done with a lot of infrastructure to get what you build into space once it's completed. And that's why it's so fascinating to look at the way it's done within the Expanse. Warships and vessels from the Expanse are actually pretty large, with the Doniger-class battleship, for example, being 400 meters long, which is fairly large even by today's warship standards. But then building that in space to operate in space is a very large challenge. So how exactly is it done? Well, it varies from location to location. So let's talk about the shipyards of the Expanse. Let's start close to home, the Bush Shipyards over Luna. The Bush Shipyards are a series of orbital shipyards in orbit of the moon. They're used primarily by the UN for building their warships, but they also play a role in building a lot of civilian ships, notably ships like the Amun-Ra class for the Protogen Corporation. It is notable that some of the Bush Shipyards facilities are actually on the surface of Luna, and that brings me to an interesting fact. It's likely that some of the smaller vessels, things like corvettes and destroyers and frigates, are built on the surface of the moon and then launched into orbit, seeing that launching from the surface of the moon isn't quite as challenging as other celestial bodies. But larger vessels, things like, for example, the Truman-class dreadnoughts, are going to be built in orbit where it's easier to manufacture them, and you don't really have to worry about the logistics of getting it into space. And while the Bush Shipyards are responsible for most of Earth's navy, there are other shipyards out there, and Mars in particular has quite a few. Now, unlike the UN's shipyard, the Bush Shipyards in orbit of Luna, Mars seems to have embraced the idea of shipyards being on the surface of a planet and launching its vehicles into orbit from there. And as a result, most of Mars's shipyards are on the surface of celestial bodies. But one of the largest ones isn't even on Mars, but is instead on Callisto, one of the moons of Jupiter. The MCRN's Callisto shipyards are some of their largest facilities away from the Red Planet. They are responsible for constructing a very large portion of the Martian Navy, and are where a lot of Martian ships are built. We know that these shipyards are on the surface of Callisto, not in orbit, and are very, very heavily defended. In fact, during the war with the UN, it was one of the key targets that the Martians really wanted to defend. But we never actually see the Callisto shipyards on screen. We do see another Martian shipyard on screen. The Mariner Valley shipyard is operated by the MCRN on Mars, and we see it used to build some of the largest ships in the Martian Navy, notably the Doniger-class battleships. We see it in operation around the middle of the series' run. And we get a good look at what it's like inside of these domed shipyards. We see them building various vessels for the Martian Navy, and it appears like, at least at some point, the idea is to open the roof of this building and launch these vessels into orbit. At least that's what makes sense to me. And once again, I think it's worth noting that unlike Earth, where they prefer to build their largest warships in orbit of the moon, the Martian shipyard seems to be building their largest warships on the surface of Mars, which has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that it's closer to home. It'd be harder for enemy agents to infiltrate these shipyards and get access to half-built Doniger-class battleships and their schematics. But on the flip side, it means you have to deal with the logistical challenge of getting that vessel from the surface of Mars into orbit. Now, depending on how powerful its Epstein drives are and what the effects of firing something like that within an atmosphere are, it may be completely negligible. But I would wager that a vessel that size, it is still a fairly insurmountable challenge to get it into space. So as we see, the UN seems to generally favor building their ships in orbit, with only smaller ships built on the surface of a celestial body, Luna, and Mars seems to prefer building their vessels in hardened facilities on the surface of planets where they can easily be defended, both from enemy intelligence and from attack. But there's one more shipyard that definitely has to be mentioned because it played a crucial role in the events of the show, and that is Tycho. Tycho is very different from the other shipyards, where Bush and the Martian shipyards seem to specialize in building warships, either for their respective governments, but also occasionally for independent factions. Tycho seems to be more dedicated to the civilian market. And it shows in the clientele we see them have. They are responsible for building the Nauvoo, a Mormon colony ship, which, by the way, I talked about in a previous video, and I'll leave a link up here if you'd like to check that out. But they also ended up building a lot of vessels for Belter factions, since Tycho was relatively cheap. They were skilled construction workers, don't get me wrong, they were masterful shipbuilders, but their proximity to the belt and their real lack of government contracts forced them to take cheaper jobs, and that meant working for sketchier customers. That's why Tycho is so crucial to the war effort of any Belter faction. It becomes the most effective place to build and repair warships. As I mentioned, one of the major shipyards of the system is the Bush Shipyards on Luna, and Luna plays a very crucial role in the system as a whole as well. And if you'd like to learn about the significance of Earth's moon within the Expanse, I'll leave a link up here to my video all about how Earth used the moon within the universe of the Expanse. And I want you to let me know down in the comments whether you think it makes more sense to build these ships in orbit, where it's logistically easier to deploy them, or to build vessels like the Doniger class, for example, on the surface of a planet where it's easier to protect the construction site. And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in the Expanse, leave it down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.